Okay. Where I left off on Thursday, we were talking about properties of living things. We were talking about different, the elements that life is made of. We were talking about the ways in which those atoms fit together to make molecules that makes metabolism and homeostasis possible. We talked about heredity and evolution and ecology. There is one more property of life, and that is that there is a ridiculous number of different varieties of living things that are out there. You do not have to memorize these numbers. They're just basically there to make you go, wow, hey, cool. But there are 5,500 known species of mammal, 10,000 species of bird, 25,000 known species of fish. And then it gets even greater when you get to the critters without backbones. It may not make you feel comfortable to know that we have almost 100,000 species of arachnid. That is spiders and scorpions and ticks and mites and other things that some of you are probably not really too happy thinking about too much. But there it is. There's almost 100,000 known species of those, nearly 1 million known species of insect. Nobody really knows how many species of living thing there are on the planet. We know of almost 2 million, but we keep finding new ones all the time. A recent conservative estimate of the number of species on the planet is nearly 9 million. And that's one of the most obvious things about life is it doesn't come in only one shape. It comes in, well, we call this biodiversity, the sheer number of different types of living things that are there on this planet, including a lot that most people never hear about. And it's a problem because everybody please mute your mic. I'm getting more snaps, crackles, and pops. It's a problem because we have to figure out how to keep track of all of this. And it makes it rough because about 18,000 new species of living thing, animal, plant, fungus, and microbe are discovered each year. This species was only discovered last year. It's a species of primate known as a mouse lemur. Although you can't fool me, it's basically Pikachu. Anyway, it's native to Madagascar. I think a relative of this species actually did show up in that movie, just as the cute little fuzzy thing. It was like the pet of the lemur dictator or something. Anyway, so yeah, we didn't find this critter until 2020. In North India, this snake was discovered in 2020 as well. We just never suspected. Okay, Mort was the name of the thing with the big eyes from Madagascar. Thank you. I don't think this has appeared in a movie as yet, but nobody knew that this snake existed until 2020 is when it was reported. This is just pretty. This is an insect that was discovered in Africa, in the country of Gabon, described in 2015, and I just include it because it's really shiny. I mean, you see damselflies around here, typically around ponds and lakes. If you've ever hung out on the shores of a lake in Arkansas, you've probably seen damselflies, but none of them quite as shiny as this. And then something else that some people might not feel comfortable about, in 2017, there was a tarantula species described from South America, from the rainforest of Guyana, noted for its iridescent blue patches. You've got blue legs and a blue abdomen. And, you know, I guess people tend not to get warm, fuzzy feelings towards spiders, but at least this one has a really cool sense of color. And this is a spider that was discovered in 2015 that I include because it looks like the sorting hat has sprouted legs. Okay, yeah, I see that Jalen can't get in. I'm not sure I can troubleshoot that from where I am. I don't know if I can be of help. Pass the word that I'm sorry he can't join us. I don't really know how I can fix that. And hopefully he can catch the recorded lecture later. Sorry, that's the best I can do at the moment. So the question arises, how do we keep track of all of these critters? You know, how do we remember what their names are and how to find them and, you know, where to look up information on them? You know, what would you type into Wikipedia if you were looking for spiders that look like the sorting hat? Well, it's hard to use common names because some species, well, first of all, many species don't have a common English name at all. There's no special name that we already have for spiders that look like the sorting hat. Okay, so looks like somebody got in. And in other cases, even in common American English, one type of animal may have several names. This is a fish that lives in fresh waters around here that people like to fish for. It fights well and it is delicious when pan-fried. And some people grow up calling this a brim. This is what my dad calls it and taught me to call it. Some people grow up calling this a perch. Others might call it a sunfish. And some people call it a bluegill. And all four names are in use to refer to the same animal species. And sometimes very different animals end up with the same name. So that fish that I showed you earlier might be known as a brim, bluegill, perch, or sunfish. But sunfish also can refer to a species living in the ocean that looks like that. That's the ocean sunfish. That is also known by the common name, the mola mola. And yes, it looks weird. It basically looks like a severed fish head swimming around happily on its own. It's a pretty weird looking thing, I assure you. But they both get called sunfish. How do we know which one we're talking about? Common names are sometimes changed. This is a deep sea fish that happens to be pretty tasty. And in the 1970s, a commercial market for this fish developed, and this fish began getting marketed in the United States under the name orange roughy. You can find frozen orange roughy at, oh heck, at Kroger, for example. I've seen it. It's a fairly common fish around here, especially among foodies. But orange roughy is a marketing name because the older name of this fish in English was the slimehead. And the people in charge of seafood marketing decided that nobody was ever going to eat slimehead. So they changed the name to orange roughy, which sounds more like something you'd eat. By the same reason, the Patagonian toothfish had to undergo a name change, and it's now known as Chilean sea bass. And people who are into seafood enjoy it very much, but it's not related to the other fish that we call bass. So common names tend not to be stable. Common names also vary in different countries, even ones that speak the same language. If you're in America, the robin is the bird on the left, which hops around on the ground and is considered a sign of spring. If you're from Britain, the robin is the bird in the center, which you can see looks rather different, and it's a symbol of Christmas. British people put those robins on their Christmas cards. And then if you're in Australia, mate, that's a robin right there on the right. They all happen to have red breasts, which is how they all got that name. Other than that, they don't really have a lot in common. I already mentioned that American robins and British robins are active at different times of the year. They've got different songs. They've got different body shapes. They've got different coloration. They're not the same type of bird at all. And it gets worse when you have to communicate with speakers of other languages, because science is international. We can collaborate with people from all over the world. I have in my day collaborated on research projects with people from Canada, Russia, Australia, California, all kinds of countries like that. And in other languages, this fish might be a Bloyal Sonnenbalsch, or a Crape Arlequin, or a Mojarra Oreja Azul, or a Simia Jaberni Solnichnik. That's Russian. I looked it up. Or in Japanese, it's the Burugiru. And I can't even read the Korean and the Chinese. If any of you can, maybe sometime you can tell me how to pronounce those. But if you're working on studying fish and you're working with somebody who grew up speaking a different language, it can be hard to be sure that you're all talking about the same fish, because science crosses national boundaries, or it should anyway. In this course, I'm going to give you some names of dead white guys and talk about the history of science a bit. The reason I do this is not because I want you to memorize the names of dead white dudes. That's really not the point. I might test you on these, but the only thing I test people on is going to be last names. So you don't have to know that this guy in the red coat was born in 1707, died in 1778. You don't have to know that he attempted to grow coffee in Sweden so that he could save his country money. It didn't work. You don't really have to know anything about him. And I teach bits of the history of biology, not so much because it's important to know all of these dead people and their names and dates, but because science grows. Science is not a fixed body of knowledge, it's a process. And people have applied the scientific method to make it grow and to contribute ideas and to test and sometimes refute and sometimes confirm hypotheses. Science does not get handed down from, Mount Sinai. Science is something people do, and it's something people have been doing for hundreds of years. And I want to give you a sense of how ideas have grown. So the only thing I'm going to hold you responsible for on the test is going to be names. So you ought to know that this guy's name is Carl Linnaeus. And I want you to focus for study purposes on what the guy did. I would also like to add that if we start in the 1700s with Carl Linnaeus, pretty much the only people who were allowed to do science at the time, whose contributions were allowed to count, were white men. This would change, and it's not where it needs to be today, but it is very different because we have a number of very, very good scientists who are women and scientists who are of color and scientists who are both. And that is as it should be. Hell, we could use more. When I have the opportunity, I will bring in some contributions that people who are not dead, white, or males have made. we can't tell the full story of science without bringing in the contributions of everybody. So yeah, be it said that I'm not trying to argue for the supremacy of dead white dudes as far as thinking goes. Focus on the ideas in this class, and focus on the ideas of Carl Linnaeus. He was a doctor. He worked in Sweden. He was so famous, he ended up as the personal doctor of the Swedish royal family. And like the Blues Brothers, he was on a mission from God, although hopefully not with that accent, because he saw himself as being on a divine mission to understand nature, and in particular to classify it. And he figured if you can just find the right way to classify all of these species of animals and plants that we're discovering and figure out what goes with what, you would get inside God's head and you could understand as much as any human could understand. Nobody would understand it all, but you would understand better what God had been thinking when he created the universe. You would be able to understand something of God's own thoughts if you just studied nature enough and figured out how to file everything and figured out how to group living things together in some sort of grand plan. This quote, by the way, is Linnaeus talking about himself in the third person. God has allowed him, he means himself, Dr. Linnaeus, to see more of his created work than any mortal before him. God has endowed him with the greatest insight into natural knowledge. This guy's ego would not fit through a barn door. Lack of self-esteem was not Carl Linnaeus's problem. If you've been wondering why the hell anybody would need some sort of classification scheme to classify tarantulas with blue knees and spiders that look like the Sorting Hat and green Indian snakes that will probably kill you, why would we need to know this at all? We've always had practical reasons, and this is one of them. That is the botanical garden where exotic plants were grown at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, where Linnaeus was a professor. And I mentioned that he was a doctor. This is a time when every doctor has to learn how to classify plants because plants are the main source of medicine. For that matter, they still are. Something like 25% of all prescription drugs either come from plants or at least were first discovered in plants before they came up with ways to make them artificially. Everything from aspirin to Sudafed to frontline cancer chemotherapy drugs and here's a great example. Couple of scientists in, I think, 2015 won the Nobel Prize for discovering a bacteria that lives in the soil that produce compounds that turned out to be useful as drugs. And one of them is called ivermectin, which is very effective if you're trying to get rid of parasites. It doesn't actually work on the virus, I'm afraid, but it is effective for treating parasite infections, sometimes in humans, more often in livestock, but it's derived from a little microscopic organism growing in soils. There's tons of examples like this. And that sets up a very practical need for somebody to keep track of the huge and growing number of species of plants that were being discovered at this time. For the simple reason that that's too many for anybody to just remember. And if you're a doctor and you give somebody the wrong plant, that person could end up with a slight case of the death. You've got to give the right medicine then as now. It's no different. So that's the practical reason for figuring out how to keep track of all of these species of living thing. Many of those species of living thing were extremely useful. Many of them still are. So completely aside from wanting to get inside God's head, Linnaeus needed to keep track of his plants for very practical reasons. So how was he going to come up with a way to classify living things? He went back to Aristotle, this ancient Greek philosopher, who had said, okay, if you want to classify things, if you have a group of things, whatever they are, and you want to classify them, the first thing you want to do is work out what makes that group entirely alike. That's called their genus, according to Aristotle. And then you can decide what makes each member of the group different from all of the others. And Aristotle called that the species. So the genus represented here is genus humanity. Man meaning, all humans, not just humans with tallywhackers. And all members of the genus humanity have 2 eyes and 1 nose and 2 ears and so on. Those are the things that make all humans alike. And then the species in this case is Aristotle, because he has features that make him different from all other humans, like a bald spot with a comb over, a big nose, a tendency to bother people by philosophizing, a brief career as tutor to Alexander the Great before Alexander decided that conquering the world was more fun than understanding it, and so on. So that's the way the Greeks did it. If you had a group of things, you found the things that all of them had in common, that's their genus, and then you find the things that make each one different from the others, and that is each one's species. So Linnaeus would have said, these are roses. They're all recognizably roses. They've got similar leaves, similar flowers, different numbers of petals, but the same basic structure, similar stems, because of course, as we know, if we had a car radio in 1987, every rose has its thorn. And all of these have thorns too. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know you're all cheering. And each of these is a different kind of rose, a different type of rose. Each one of those is, thank you, Jared, a separate species of rose. So the genus here would be rose, and then each of these would be a different species because it's got features that make it different from all others. So one of Linnaeus's innovations was representing that with names in 2 parts. We call this binomial nomenclature. Biological species should be given 2-part Latin names. Latin because at the time that was the language of educated people, well, not truly worldwide, but certainly all over Europe and even in, the American colonies. People who were educated in the European tradition knew Latin. It was the international language of scholars. And so biological species get 2-part Latin names. The first part of the name is a word for the genus, and the second part is a word for the species. So all 3 of these roses are in genus Rosa, but the one on the left is Rosa canina, the one in the middle is Rosa gallica, and the one on the right is Rosa grandiflora. It works a little bit the way last names do, except in reverse. Like my last name tells you that I'm part of a family called Wagoner, and my first name tells you that I'm Ben Wagoner and not Roger Wagoner, my father, or Beth Wagoner, my sister, or Richard Wagoner, my uncle, or Andrew Wagoner, my cousin, who, by the way, is a noted classical music composer. I've got talent on that side of the family. And so on. It works the same way here, except the order of the words is reversed. The first one tells you what larger group your animal or plant belongs to, and the second part of the name tells you which specific species you're dealing with. This makes life a lot easier because before that, scholars had been using these very long Latin names, and this rose would be called Rosa sylvestris alba cum rubore folio glabro. That's rose of the forest, white with a blush and smooth leaves. Okay, that's a nice description, but it's a lot to remember. Not everybody would necessarily describe this plant in exactly the same way. And it's much simpler to deal with if you replace all of that with Rosa canina. We still use these Linnaean-style binomial names in Latin for all species by international agreement. There's no real legal penalty if you refuse to. This is just the way that scientists around the world, even in India, China, Africa, places that never spoke Latin, this is the way they've agreed to operate. Not that it's really critical, but when we write these names, the names are italicized, the genus is capitalized, but the species name never is. So instead of having to worry about whether this thing is a bluegill or a Sinja jabedni solnichnik, or a sunfish, or a Bloyal Sonnenbausch, or a Mojarra oreja azul, it's Lepomus macrochirus. Now, you're not required to call it that. You can call it anything you want to. Lepomus macrochirus, though, is what you would type into Wikipedia if you wanted to find out information on this fish. And if I was having to work with scientists from other parts of the country, or other countries, whether they speak English or not, it might not be clear what I'm talking about. For example, in Europe, if you say brim, that refers to a very different type of fish. If you say sunfish, maybe I mean an ocean sunfish. But if I say Lepomus macrochirus, everybody at least knows where to look that up. It's at least an internationally agreed on standard name. And again, not every scientist would have this memorized, but at least we know where to look for information about it if we needed to. By the way, I will never make you memorize a Latin name, so you do not have to know. I will never ask you, what's the Latin name of the wild forest rose? Well, the answer is Rosa canina, but I would never ask you that. I would never ask you, what's the Latin name of the bluegill? So you do not have to memorize these Latin names unless you want to. Might come in handy if you go to work for Arkansas Department of Game and Fish. What I want you to do is just to see how the system works. That solves our robin problem. If I'm talking to a bunch of scientists and I talk about robins, they may not know exactly what I'm referring to, but bird specialists would keep them straight by calling the American robin Turdus migratorius. Turdus, by the way, is Latin for thrush. It's got nothing to do with poo. The European robin is Erythacus rubecula, and the Australian robin is Petroica phoenicia. Technically, the names don't have to be in proper Latin. You can borrow names from any language. Just for example, the plant down below is native to China, although it's been planted around the world. And we've actually got a couple of nice ones growing out back of the Lewis Science Center. Their leaves turn a beautiful gold in late summer and early fall. The plant's Latin name is Ginkgo biloba, and ginkgo was borrowed from the Chinese. I assume that's a decent representation of what it's called in Chinese. The fish up there at the top is native to places like the Red Sea, where the local language is Arabic, and the genus name is Abu Defdof, which I am told is Arabic for father of stripes, because that's a very stripy fish. Now, Saxatilis is Latin. Saxatilis means found among the rocks, which describes where you would find a fish like this. And biloba means having two lobes, which describes the shape of the leaves. But there's no reason why you can't borrow names from any language, or in some cases, even just make them up. The rules are you have to be able to spell them and pronounce them in the Latin alphabet. And they follow some very boring rules of Latin grammar, which we don't need to worry about. Look up the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature if you really must know the details, but really you don't. The names also have to be unique. If two species accidentally get the same name, one or the other has to be renamed, and there's some boring rules about which one it is. You can't rename species just on a whim. I couldn't rename that stripy fish Fred Saxatilis or anything like that. I'm not allowed to do that. I mean, I could, but nobody else would use that name. It would never catch on. There are circumstances where you can change names, but again, that's all governed by a bunch of very boring rules that we don't need to get into for our purposes here. And by the way, names do not have to be accurate descriptions. This is a European bird. We have similar ones in America, but the name of this bird is Apus apus. Apus happens to mean no foot in Greek, but Greek that's borrowed into Latin. A lot of our Latin names are actually Greek that Latin borrowed because they did that. So the name of this bird basically means footless, footless. And that's because it spends so much time flying. It's a master acrobatic flyer. It can stay in the air for many hours, and it was once believed that it had no feet. And you certainly can't see them in that picture. Now, the truth is it does have feet, but because of this old folk belief that it had no feet, it was given the name Apus apus, footless, footless, or no foot, no foot. And that's just an example of the fact that names do not necessarily have to be accurate descriptions. They can be, they often are. As I mentioned, Saxatilis means found among rocks, and biloba means divided into two lobes. Both of those are pretty accurate descriptions, but names don't have to be accurate descriptions. Names can come from anywhere. Okay, so species that are similar end up in the same genus. Down there at the lower left, that's our friend Lepomus macrochirus, that's the bluegill. Up top, Lepomus gibbosus is the pumpkin seed. Over at the right, Lepomus cyanellus is the green sunfish. You could find all of these in Arkansas, by the way. I think the pumpkin seed's usually a little too small to eat, but you can catch them. And these three species and about 10 more all go in the genus Lepomus. I'm not showing you all of the 12 or 13 species I'm just showing you 3, but all of these species go in genus Lipomus, and you can see they've got pretty similar proportions, very similar shapes of the fin, shape of the body, even similar markings. So they're all similar enough to go in the same genus. Genera that are similar go in the same family. So down there at the lower left, these species go in genus Lipomus. And again, there's about 13 species. I'm only showing you 4, but all of these species go in genus Lipomus. Up here at the top, those are similar to the fish in the genus Lipomus, but they're different enough we place them in a different genus, the genus Pomoxis. That's the genus of crappies. You're looking at black crappie and white crappie. Crappies are the fish that my across the street neighbor is always taking his boat out onto Lake Conway, and as far as I can tell, never catching any, but it's never stopped him. Anyway, if you go fishing, you might know there's supposed to be crappie in Lake Conway, and they're good to eat and fun to catch. Over here on the right, these fish are, I think there's about 6 or 7 species. I'm only showing you 2 in genus Micropterus, the genus of freshwater black basses. So largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, Alabama bass, red-eyed bass, not the striped bass that they catch up at Greer's Ferry Lake. That's actually in a different genus. But anyway, those basses are in the genus Micropterus. And all 3 of these genera, Pomoxis, Lipomus, and Micropterus, go into a larger grouping called a family. And the family is the family Centrarchidae. And several families go into a larger grouping called an order, and several orders go into an even larger grouping called a class, and several classes go into an even larger grouping called a phylum, and multiple phyla will go into an even bigger grouping called a kingdom, and many kingdoms go into the largest grouping, a grouping called a domain. Here's how this works. Our fish right there is in the domain Eukarya. I'll be talking more about the domain Eukarya later on. And again, I will never ask you to memorize, well, maybe Eukarya, but I will never ask you to memorize most of these names that you're going to see. I want you to see how the system operates. The domain Eukarya includes all living things whose cells contain a structure that holds the DNA called a nucleus. So fish are in the domain Eukarya, so are you, so are plants and flowers, so are mushrooms. Lots of things are in the domain Eukarya. We divide the domain Eukarya up into several kingdoms. And within the domain Eukarya, our fish is in the kingdom Animalia, the animals, which is all members of the Eukarya that are multi-celled and held together with a protein called collagen, various other things I might mention later. We can divide the kingdom Animalia into about 30 phyla, and one of these is the phylum Chordata. That's all animals that have a nerve cord running down the back. Almost all of those also have a backbone protecting the nerve cord, although there's a few that don't. So the kingdom Animalia has maybe between 25 and 30 phyla. There's a bit of debate about some of them. The phylum that this fish is in is the phylum Chordata, because it's got a nerve cord running down its backside. Within that phylum, it's in a class, the class Actinopterygii, which is a mouthful. It just means chordata that have fins that are held up by rays. You know where the fish's fins are, and unlike some fish, like sharks, the fins of this fish are held up by these little stiff extensions. They may be kind of bony, they might be kind of floppy, but if you've ever handled a fish, you've seen the rays of the fin. So that's what this refers to. That class Actinopterygii is divided into many orders. The order in this case is the order Perciformes, fish that are shaped like perch, that have bony rays at the front of the dorsal fin. The order is divided into many families, and this fish goes in the family Centrarchidae. Centrarchidae is divided into several genera, one of which is genus Lepomus. And Lepomus is divided up into 12 or 13 species, one of which is the species Lepomus macrochirus, the bluegill. So what we have to classify things is what we call a ranked hierarchy. And the closest example I can think of is something I always get wrong. I don't have a military background, but if you're in the Army, you know, you might start out, if you're in the infantry, as part of a fire team. And then several fire teams are grouped together to make a platoon. And then several platoons are grouped together to make a company. And then several companies are grouped together to make a regiment. And then I think several regiments are grouped together to make a battalion, and so on. I can't remember the precise details, but it's something like that. And it's the same thing here. Just like several soldiers make a fire team, and several fire teams make a platoon, and several platoons make a company. Okay, Mr. Amarsi says correct. Okay, I'm glad I got that right. So just as several soldiers make a team, and several teams make a platoon, and several platoons make a company, and several companies make a regiment, or is it a brigade? Anyway, several species make a genus, and several genera make a family, and several families make an order, and so on. So you could think of this as like a whole bunch of boxes nested inside boxes, with the difference is that every box is assigned a rank, and the ranks are arranged in a hierarchy. Okay. So yes, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Very easy to remember. Do kings play chess on fat green stools? Did King Paul come over from Germany swiftly? Do kinky perverts come out for good sex? There's lots of ways you can remember this rank hierarchy. I will probably ask at least one or two questions on the first exam about these levels in the hierarchy. It's not the most important thing, but I'll probably throw one or two in your direction just to keep you on your toes. Okay, I want to look a little bit more carefully at exactly what we mean by species. Linnaeus defined species as organisms that share a distinctive physical feature. So here's a fish, and this is another one that you might catch in Arkansas. If we draw an imaginary line vertically that just touches the back edge of the eye, what you can see is that the upper jawbone, that's this, extends past that vertical line that we drew. That, according to Linnaeus, is what makes this thing Micropterus salmoides, the largemouth bass, and not Micropterus dolomieu, the smallmouth bass, or Micropterus punctulatus, the spotted bass, or Micropterus cusei, the Alabama bass, and so on. That shared distinctive feature is what makes this largemouth bass and not any other kind of bass. Definitely not the singing bass, though I think those went out of style about 20 years ago. Anybody ever seen Billy the Singing Bass? Never mind. It's a piece of pop culture.
They're still around.
They're still around?
Some of them. I think they sell on Amazon or something.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. All right. I'm not sure what species Billy the Singing Bass is, but anyway, feeling a little sorry I brought it up. But yeah, that feature is what makes this thing Micropterus salmoides and not anything else. The problem is that most species are extremely variable. One species that varies a lot is humanity. People have been connecting their Alexas to Billy the Singing Bass. Oh boy. Oh, what times we live in. Technology, making life better. Anyway, right. In our own species, we vary a great deal in skin color, hair texture, height and weight and build and things like that. We're all different, and yet humanity is all one species. If you want another example, this happens to be shells of a tropical snail from Cuba, belonging to the species Polymita picta. And I'm showing you this because you can see every shell is different. And maybe you could try to divide this group of shells into separate species, but it's not clear where you would draw the lines. Like you could try to separate out, all the yellow snails as one species right there. But wait a minute, this one only has a tiny bit of yellow. It's mostly kind of, dark green. So maybe we should group this one with this one down here, which is the same basic color and striping pattern, except it doesn't have yellow. And maybe we should group this one with the yellows, but it actually is more green than yellow. So maybe it should go with this one. You get the idea. This is a variable species, and it's not obvious how you could divide it up. Linnaeus's way of defining species is what we now call the morphological species concept. I will never ask you to define words in Greek or Latin, but some people find that it helps if I break the meaning down. Morpho means having to do with shape. So in the morphological species concept, we define species by their physical features. And as we've seen, this can get really ambiguous. A better way of doing it, which was worked out in the 1930s by a guy named Ernst Mayr, is the biological species concept, where you define species as a group of individuals that all have the potential to interbreed. All members of a species are potentially able to interbreed with each other. I mean, unless they're both of the same sex or something like that. Although quite a lot of animals and most plants actually have both sex organs in one individual, so it's kind of moot there. Humans are considered one species because humans of any race or ethnic group are perfectly capable of having healthy babies with humans of any other ethnic group. And that's happened all through human history, sometimes in nice ways and sometimes in very ugly ways, but it's happened. All members of humanity who are otherwise healthy and fertile can have kids with all other members of humanity of the opposite biological sex, if they're healthy and fertile and all that. Species are reproductively isolated from all others because members of one species, usually, there's some gray area here that we don't have time for, but usually members of one species can't produce healthy and fertile offspring by breeding with other species. Supposedly, this has been tried back in the 30s. I certainly would not recommend doing it now. This is ethically, really gross. But there were experiments done with trying to interbreed humans and chimps, and the result was nothing. Humans and chimpanzees are different enough from each other that even if you did try to interbreed them, you wouldn't get any offspring. Slightly less horrifying example, horses and donkeys are considered separate species because if you breed them, you get mules, which are perfectly beautiful animals, but they're sterile. Mules do not produce more mules. Mules don't make functioning eggs or sperm. Okay, right. When we use the biological species concept, though, you sometimes find species that you can't tell apart by looking. Over on the left is a bird you can spot around here in the winter, especially if you leave seed out. That's the Carolina chickadee. It's called that because that's the sound it makes. They go chickadee, chickadee. So that's the Carolina chickadee. And again, it's pretty easy to see around here. Just leave seed outside in wintertime and they'll come and eat it. Over there on the right is the black-capped chickadee, and you can't tell them apart by looking. They look identical. The difference is they live in different areas. The black-capped chickadee lives to the north of us. We don't get it down here in Arkansas. They've got different songs, and they don't interbreed. You could put female Carolina chickadees and male black-capped chickadees together, and you would not get any offspring out of them. They don't recognize each other as potential mates. So we'd call these cryptic species. Sometimes you get two species that look alike, but under the biological species concept, they're separate because they can't or never do interbreed. That's just the way things go. Okay, so let me see how much time we've got. Oh, loads of time. I still own you guys for 14 minutes. So I told you that rank hierarchy that we classify living things in. Every domain contains several kingdoms. Every kingdom has phyla. Every phylum has classes. Every class contains orders. Every order contains families. Every family contains genera. That's the plural of genus, by the way, is genera. And every genus contains at least one species. We don't have time to cover all of this, but I do want to spend at least this week trying to get all of the players on stage. And introduce you at least to the main domains and kingdoms of life that we know. And at the very top level, there's 3 basic domains of life. Every living thing that we have ever seen falls into one of these 3. The one that you belong to is called the eukarya. You'll also see it called eukaryotes. Again, I will never ask you to translate these names out of Greek and Latin, but if it helps, karyon, sometimes with a C and sometimes with a K, is Greek for the kernel of a nut. And why are these things being named after nuts? It's because when you look at them under the microscope, the cells that they're made of contain flexible sacs called nuclei. The singular is a nucleus. So if I look at a eukaryotic cell under a microscope, the cell is going to look like this. And then in the center, usually in the center, it can be pushed around. There's typically a round lump in the middle. I'm going to try to shade it in there. That may look a little bit darker than the rest of the cell. looking like the kernel of the kernel inside a nut, if you squint and if you're on drugs. Right. That sac contains the genetic material of the cell. It's stuff that we call DNA. The second part of the course, you're going to learn more about DNA than you ever thought possible. DNA is the physical stuff that makes heredity possible. It's what organisms pass to later generations that enables them to inherit traits. The reason why you look more like your biological parents than anybody else is because that you inherited DNA from both parents. And that's true for all life. I'll be talking a lot more about DNA later. I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves for now. But eukaryotes are cells or made of cells that contain these nuclei, these sacs where the DNA is stored. And eukaryote cells are also, when you look at their structure, they're compartmentalized. And they've got lots of different compartments inside that carry out different functions. A little bit like the organs of your body each have different functions. You know, some things are done by your liver, some things are done by your kidneys, some things are done by your heart and your lungs. It's the same thing with eukaryotes. These different compartments carry out different functions, different tasks that are needed to keep the cell alive. And those compartments are called organelles. You could think of a eukaryote as being organized like, well, like the Lewis Science Center, where you're going to be meeting for labs in 2 weeks, because Lewis is divided up into lots of rooms, and different rooms have different functions. Some are classrooms, some are faculty offices, some are storage rooms, some are the rooms where we keep the heating and air conditioning, the HVAC, some are research labs, and so on. So eukaryotes have nuclei, and they're divided into these compartments that we call organelles. Archaea and bacteria both don't have nuclei, and they don't have these compartments. They look kind of like this. There might be this DNA stuff. DNA is common to all life. So the DNA kind of floats around in the middle, but there isn't a special sac for it to go in. And typically there aren't any compartments inside the cell.
Just make sure that
Archaea is, if a eukaryote is like Lewis Science Center, Archaea would be like the indoor practice facility, which is mostly, they might have a few side rooms. I'm not really sure. I don't think I've ever been in there, but most of that facility is one giant room, right? That covers about half a football field. And just about everything that goes on in the football practice facility goes on in that one big space. That's what archaea and bacteria are like. And archaea and bacteria are both referred to as prokaryotes because they don't have this nucleus or organelles. There are major differences between archaea and bacteria, and I'm going to kind of wave my arms and pretend they're not there. The differences involve a lot of biochemistry that you're perfectly capable of understanding, but we don't have time. So it's more detailed than we have time for. When I simplify things, it's not because I'm assuming you guys are idiots. You know, you're not dumb just because you're taking, 1400 instead of 1440, but we've got a lot of material to cover and only so much time to cover it. And there's some cases where I just kind of wave my hands and say, just take my word for it. If you want to get deeper into this, there is always Wikipedia. So those are the three domains of life. In an upcoming lab, you'll look at some eukaryotes under a microscope, and you'll see the nuclei of your own cells, if everything goes well. That's the nucleus of one of your skin cells. There's the cell, and inside is that dot, that's the nucleus. You'll look at some plant cells that have these little green things floating around inside them. Those are organelles. A lot of eukaryote complexity is not easy to see with the light microscope, but if we look using a different gizmo called a transmission electron microscope, you can see there's a lot going on inside this eukaryotic cell. I'm outlining the nucleus right here. This grainy thing in the middle is the nucleus. There's a dark spot inside called the nucleolus. We'll get to that later. Don't worry about the nucleolus. And then surrounding it, we've got various organelles. And some of them look kind of dark, and some of them have things inside, and some of them look, big and open and empty. All I want you to get from this picture is there's a lot of internal subdivisions and internal structure in a eukaryote. And towards the end of the course, we'll get more into what all of these do. Using the same type of microscope, a bacterium looks like this. There's an outside to it. Surrounding the outside, there's a stiff layer called a cell wall, by the way. But inside the cell, everything just looks kind of grainy and fuzzy. You don't get that division into compartments the way you would with a eukaryote. Both bacteria and archaea are called prokaryotes. Up at the top, you can see you can't really tell the difference by looking. That's archaea at the top, bacteria at the bottom. They've got different cell shapes, but don't worry about that. That varies a lot. Both archaea cells and bacteria cells tend to be very small. Typical size would be 1 to 5 microns. A micron, by the way, is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. I assume you've heard of millimeters. That's 1,000th of a meter. A millimeter might be the thickness of the wire making up a pretty good sized paper clip. That's roughly a millimeter. 1/1000th of that thickness is a micron. Typical human hair would be, one hair is about 40 microns wide, although it depends on your personal hair texture, but 40, 50 microns is about average. So these archaea and bacteria might be 50 times smaller than the thickness of a human hair. You can't see them with the naked eye. They don't look obviously different from each other because the differences involve some pretty complicated chemistry that I'm just going to pretend doesn't exist. The one thing I want you to know about archaea is that many of them live in what we call extreme environments, environments that are too hot or too cold or too salty or too acid or too alkaline for anything else to live in. This is what you'd see on approach to San Francisco International Airport. These are ponds operated by the Cargill Company at the south end of San Francisco Bay. They let seawater into these ponds and then let the ponds evaporate until all the water's gone and all that's left is salt. And then they bulldoze up the salt and, well, purify it and then sell it. As those ponds are drying out, the water in them gets saltier and saltier. And as it gets salty, fewer and fewer living things can survive in it until when it's at its saltiest, the only thing that can live in there is archaea of species that can tolerate very high salt concentrations, higher than anything else. Archaea that can do that are called halophilic. And that's an example of an extremophile, an organism that can live in an environment that is too extreme in some way for anything else to survive. So there are archaeans that can live happily in the saltiest water on Earth. You really do not want to insult these archaea because they'll get salty. Hardy har har. The colors of this hot spring in Yellowstone are mats of archaea that are called thermophilic that can live comfortably in water that's nearly boiling. There have been cases of people jumping into this hot spring and dying horribly. This is not a hot spring that you can bathe in. This will kill you. This will boil you in minutes if you jump in. But there are archaeans making these colorful mats around the edge of the spring that can live there perfectly happily. There's archaeans that live in this river in Spain in water that is about as acid as lemon juice and loaded with heavy metal. I don't mean Iron Maiden, I mean cadmium and lead. And there's even archaeans that live in superheated water thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean. They're thriving at temperatures that are hotter than boiling water. So that's the main thing I want you to know about archaeans, is that many of them are extremophiles, and I will stop there because it's time. So I will stop the recording